He paid her father's debts in raw beaver pelts and a leather pouch of gold dust, and she walked out of her family's homestead in the gray November fog of the Alberta foothills without looking back. She didn't look back because she couldn't bear to see her father's face, the relief on it. To Thea Winslow, the man who had purchased her contract was nothing more than a shadow she had glimpsed once, across the yard of Halverson's trading post, enormous and fur-draped and entirely without expression. She had heard his name spoken in the settlements like a warning. Calloway, the trapper from the high Rockies, the one who didn't come down until the passes closed. She had no idea he had been watching her for 11 years. The autumn of 1883 had been particularly merciless to the foothills settlements west of Calgary. 3 consecutive seasons of failing crops had reduced the Winslow homestead to little more than a wind-scoured patch of mud and broken ambition. Thea's father, Hugh Winslow, was not a cruel man. He was simply a beaten one, a man who had followed the promise of the Canadian frontier west from Ontario and found that the land did not care about promises. The soil near Pincher Creek was unforgiving, the winters were long and had teeth, and Hugh's promissory notes at the Halverson trading post had accumulated like snow on a weak roof until the whole structure of their lives was at risk of collapse. Thea was 22 years old. She was not particularly tall, but she had her mother's straight-backed posture, which made her seem taller than she was. Her hair was the color of creek water in summer, a shifting brown gold, and she wore it in a practical knot at the base of her neck. Her hands were rough from the farm. Her eyes, a pale, steady gray, were the kind that didn't look away from difficult things. She was inside the cabin, darning a wool sock when she heard the voice in the yard. It was not loud. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men who came to collect debts raised their voices as if volume were a substitute for dignity. This one spoke quietly, and because of that, every word carried clearly through the weathered timber walls. "You owe Halverson $43 in credit and 2 seasons of unpaid grain storage," the voice said. "That's not a debt that clears itself." Her father's response was a low, broken murmur she couldn't make out. "There's a third option." A pause. Long enough that Thea set down the sock and moved to the window. "I need someone to keep the cabin through the winter. Cook, mend, manage the stores. A year's contract. It clears everything you owe Halverson, and I'll add a cord of seasoned spruce for your stove." Thea pressed close to the glass. In the yard, her father stood with his shoulders folded inward like a man bracing against wind even on a still day, and before him stood the trapper. He was not what she had expected from the stories. She had expected something wild and unkempt. What she saw was a man of perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat lined with sheepskin. He had a jaw like a piece of split firewood and eyes she couldn't read at this distance. A long scar ran from below his left ear toward his collar. He held his hat in his hands, which she thought was a strange courtesy for a man conducting what amounted to a transaction in human labor. "She's not a servant," her father said. "I know what she is," the trapper said quietly. What followed was the longest silence of Thea's life, and then her father said yes. She packed her mother's Bible, 2 wool dresses, a tin of caraway seeds she'd been saving, and a small watercolor set she'd had since childhood. She did not allow herself to cry until she was on the horse he'd provided, picking up the trail north into the hills with the trapper riding 15 feet ahead of her and saying nothing at all. His name, she learned over the first 3 days, was not offered freely. He gave it eventually only because she asked directly. "Calloway," he said, "that's a surname." He rode another quarter-mile before he answered. "Broderick." She tried it in her mind. Broderick Calloway. It suited him in the way that names sometimes suit people who have grown fully into themselves. The name hard-edged, the man the same. He was not unkind on the trail. She'd prepared herself for worse. He set up her bedroll on the sheltered side of the fire each night without comment, ensured the horse she rode was watered and rubbed down before his own, and once, when they crossed a half-frozen creek and she miscalculated the footing and went down hard onto her knee on the icy gravel. He was off his horse and beside her with a speed that startled her, his large hand steadying her elbow before she fully processed the fall. "I'm fine," she said reflexively. He looked at her knee. "Doesn't look fine. I've had worse." He stepped back. "I don't doubt it." On the fourth evening, the temperature dropped so severely that even the fire seemed uncertain of itself. Thea sat wrapped in everything she owned, still shivering so badly that her tin cup rattled against her teeth. She heard him stand, heard the rustle of heavy canvas, and then a massive sheepskin-lined coat settled over her shoulders from behind. She turned. He'd returned to his side of the fire in his shirt and vest, seemingly unbothered by the cold that had been threatening to split her in two. "You'll freeze," she said. "I've been cold before. That's not an argument." The corners of his mouth did something, not quite a smile, a small, reluctant recognition of the word argument, perhaps. "Go to sleep, Miss Winslow." She kept the coat on. She told herself it was only practical. The cabin was not what she'd feared. She had imagined a one-room hovel, dark and reeking of old animal fat. What she found, cresting a long ridge above a hidden valley in the Livingstone Range, was a structure of remarkable solidity. Squared logs precisely fitted, a stone chimney, a root cellar dug deep enough to hold through any winter. 2 rooms, the main living space with its iron stove and work table and shelves of organized provisions, and a smaller room at the back with a narrow bed, a hook for clothes, and a window that faced east. "You take the bedroom," Broderick said, setting her bag down beside the door. "Where do you sleep?" He indicated the main room, where a pile of folded elk hides sat beside the hearth. "I wake early. Better out here anyway." She stood in the center of the main room, looking at the tin of caraway seeds she was still holding for some reason. The terrifying arithmetic of her situation was assembling itself clearly, alone, a mountain's distance from anyone she knew, with a man she didn't understand. And then she noticed the shelf above the hearth. It held the ordinary objects of a working man's life, a powder horn, a whetstone, a rusted tin compass. But on the far end, slightly apart from the rest, sat a small object that made no sense in that context. She crossed the room and picked it up. It was a small carved wooden loon, the kind of bird that cries across Canadian lake water in the summer. It was not a crude carving. The detail was patient and fine, the feathers etched with a steady hand. The wood was dark with age and handling, worn perfectly smooth at the breast, where a thumb had rested against it many times. Thea went very still. She was 9 years old again. A summer afternoon at Lake Minnewaska, the water cold and gold in the low light. She'd waded too far out, misjudged the drop, and gone under. She remembered the cold silence of the water, the blind upward scrambling, and then hands pulling her to the rocky shore. She'd lain coughing in the sedge grass, and a boy, a tall, angular boy of about 15, with a serious face and a scar already forming on his jaw from some prior accident, had pressed something small and wooden into her palm and told her, with the practical gravity of a much older person, that she should keep it. For luck. She had lost it a week later. She had never forgotten it. Thea turned the loon over in her hands. On the base, barely legible, 2 initials had been scratched into the wood. BC. She was still holding it when the door opened, and Broderick came in from checking the horses, stamping snow from his boots. He looked up, saw her standing at the hearth, saw what was in her hands. The stillness that moved through him was like weather changing. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence do its work. Then, Lake Minnewaska, the summer of 1872. He didn't move toward her or away from her. He stood in the doorway with the cold air still coming off his coat and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and almost frightened. "You were 9, he said finally. "You were 15. She set the loon carefully back on the shelf. "You disappeared before my father found us on the shore. I asked about you for weeks. No one knew who you were." He came inside then, slowly, and closed the door. He went to the stove and added a log without looking at her. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. My family was moving west, he said at last, his voice lower than usual. We were with a homesteading party out of Manitoba. My mother died of fever near the mountains. My father didn't survive the winter after that. He was quiet for a moment. I was taken in by a Métis trapper named Auguste, who taught me what the high country needed to teach. I didn't go back east. There was nothing to go back to. But why? Thea stopped. She reformulated. When you made the arrangement with my father, did you know who I was? He turned then. The firelight caught the scar along his jaw, which she now understood was older than she'd assumed. I came down to Halverson's in September for winter provisions, he said. You were outside. You had your hair down. A pause. The way you tilted your head when you were reading the notice board, I knew. The air in the cabin had changed. You spent your gold on a debt that wasn't yours, Thea said. Not an accusation. More like something she was testing the weight of. The gold was just sitting in the ground, Broderick said. I panned it out of the creek above the north pasture over 2 summers. It wasn't doing anything useful. You could have simply. You didn't have to. Halverson was about to put your father out in November, Broderick said, and something in his voice finally surfaced, something he'd kept very carefully down. And the man he was going to sell the debt to was not someone who deals in debts only. He looked at her steadily. I heard them talking in the back of the post. I know what kind of arrangement he had in mind for you. Thea sat down on the bench beside the work table. The carved loon was 6 feet away on the shelf. Outside, the wind was beginning to work itself up against the eaves. He had not bought her. He had bought her out. The winter that followed was unlike anything Thea had prepared herself for, and unlike anything she had feared. It was not servitude. It was not captivity. It was something that had no name she'd been given, something that accumulated in small daily increments, the way snowpack does, silently, and with enormous eventual weight. She learned to split kindling without crushing her thumb. He taught her to read the weather in the way the clouds stacked over the western peaks, and which stack meant 3 hours, and which meant 3 days. She learned to set rabbit snares and, later, to skin what they caught. He did not make her feel incompetent for not knowing. He simply showed her once and trusted her to apply it. She, in turn, found him reading in the evenings a battered copy of Sir Walter Scott, and began reading aloud to them both, after supper, first tentatively, then with more confidence when she realized he was genuinely listening, not simply tolerating. She made sourdough from a starter she cultivated from the flour and water, and the particular air of that valley. She baked caraway seed biscuits on Sunday mornings, and the first time she set the plate in front of him, he looked at it for a moment before eating, with an expression she couldn't interpret. My mother made these, he said. She didn't say anything. She put another one on his plate. In late January, a cold arrived that was not a cold so much as a judgment. 40 below by the mercury, the kind of temperature that makes wood protest and breath crystallize before it leaves the mouth. One night, around 2 in the morning, Thea was jolted awake by the sound of the horses in an absolute panic, a high, frantic sound that meant predator, not weather. She heard Broderick move before she was fully awake. By the time she'd pulled on her boots and coat, he was already outside with the lantern and the heavy rifle. She went to the window. In the shifting yellow arc of the lantern, she could see it. A wolf, enormous and bone-thin from the deep winter, pressed flat against the fence rail of the small paddock, its eyes catching the light like 2 pieces of flint. Broderick raised the rifle. The wolf moved the instant before the shot, a fluid, panicked lunge. Not at the horses, at him. The lantern went dark. Thea did not think. She moved, she grabbed the birch branch she kept for poking the stove, yanked open the door and ran into the dark, and the killing cold in her nightgown and coat. The wolf was on Broderick, its jaws locked on his forearm where he'd thrown it up to protect his throat. He was driving his knee upward, trying to break its grip, and the rifle was somewhere in the snow. She swung the birch branch with everything she had, connecting solidly with the wolf's ribs. It released. She swung again. It backed, snarling, and then turned and fled into the dark timber at the edge of the clearing. Broderick was on one knee in the snow. She grabbed his uninjured arm and hauled. "Get up," she said. "We have to get inside." "I'm aware," he said through his teeth. Inside by the stove, she worked on his arm with the clean linen from her sewing kit and the tin of pine tar salve he kept in the supplies. The bite was deep on the forearm, but had not found the major vessels, which she understood was luck rather than plan. She packed and wrapped it, her hands steady in a way she noted distantly, and filed away as something to think about later. He sat through the whole thing without flinching. He watched her face while she worked. "You could have stayed inside," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "That was a considerable risk you took." "You taught me about risk," she said, tying off the bandage. "You said it's not about whether something is dangerous. It's about what you're willing to leave undone if you don't act." He was quiet for a long time. "I said that about checking the trap line in a storm," he said. "I generalized." Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. It was not the small, near smile she had catalogued over the months. It was something fuller and more undefended, and it lasted only a moment before he looked away at the fire. But she had seen it. The fever came for him 2 days later. Not severe. His constitution was not a thing that broke easily, but enough that he slept badly and ate nothing and ran hot enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him when she changed the dressing. She sat with him through the worst of it, reading aloud from the Scot even when he appeared to be sleeping, because she had learned that he could hear her regardless. On the 3rd day he woke fully, drank the broth she'd kept warm, and looked at her with the clear, direct gaze she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he took seriously. "Thea," he said. He had never used her given name before. "You're better," she said. "Yes." He looked at his bandaged arm, then back at her. "I owe you a considerable debt." "You owe Halverson a considerable debt," she said. "I'm even." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, without warning, and with the careful, deliberate quality of a man who has spent a long time deciding something, he reached out with his good hand and covered hers where it rested on the edge of his blanket. He didn't say anything. She didn't pull away. By April, when the snowpack began to relax and the creek below the valley ran loud and brown with melt, Thea had not thought about leaving for a long time. The contract, that strange transactional thing, had dissolved somewhere in the winter without either of them marking its disappearance. She had stopped thinking of herself as a woman working off a debt and started thinking of herself as a woman who knew this particular valley, its moods and its hidden places, the way she had once known the streets of the town she'd grown up in. Better, maybe. It was the first week of April when they heard horses on the upper trail. Broderick was at the creek running the winter's accumulated pelts, and Thea was in the garden plot turning the first of the soil when she heard them. Multiple horses, picking their way down the eastern switchback. She straightened. 4 riders. They wore the heavy oilskin coats of men who traveled professionally, not settlers or trappers. The one in front had a face she knew. It was her father's creditor from Calgary, not Halverson, the other one. The one Broderick had overheard. His name was Vetch, and he had the sort of face that had learned early to present itself as pleasant. He raised a hand in greeting as he rode into the yard. "Morning, miss," he said. "I'm looking for the trapper Calloway. We've had some information that the valley here sits above a significant mineral deposit. Silver, most likely. The survey crew was through last fall." He smiled. His men fanned loosely behind him, casual, but not accidental. As the contracted labor on this land, any mineral rights claims would need to be settled through the landowner. That'd be you, if I'm understanding the arrangement. Thea's hands, dirty from the garden, went very still at her sides. She understood in that moment with perfect clarity what he was actually saying. The land the cabin sat on was not Broderick's by deed. He had built here by homesteader's use, which was not the same thing, and a mineral rights claim would require her signature. Her as the female contracted party because Vetch had done his legal research carefully to redirect to a proxy. He had a document ready. She could see it folded in his inside coat pocket. "I'd need to review any document before I sign," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "Of course." He reached inside his coat. "With my husband present." Vetch paused. "Calloway is my husband," Thea said. "We were married in February." Reverend Desjardins came up from Pincher Creek. This was not true. She said it with the steadiness of something she had simply decided was true. The way you decide a foothold is solid before you put your weight on it. Any claim on this land or its mineral rights goes through both of us. You're welcome to wait while I get him from the creek." Vetch studied her face. His pleasant expression was doing careful calculations. "That's some distance," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Or you can come back when the survey documents are officially registered and we've had time to consult a land solicitor in Calgary. We'll be down in May." One of the men behind Vetch shifted in his saddle. The morning was very quiet. Up the ridge, a whiskey jack called twice and went silent. Vetch refolded his coat. "May," he said. "We'll do that." They turned and rode back up the trail in the same careful way they'd come down. Thea watched until the last horse disappeared into the timber. Then she sat down on the turned earth of the garden plot, her legs not entirely reliable, and breathed. She was still sitting there when she heard Broderick's boots on the path from the creek. He took in the churned hoof marks in the yard, then her. He crouched down in front of her. "Who came?" she told him. All of it, in order, including the part she had invented. He was very still through the recounting. When she finished, he said, "You told him we were married." "I did. That was quick thinking." "It was the only thing that would complicate his paperwork," she said. "A single woman contracted to a man on disputed land is a much simpler target. A wife has standing." She looked at him. "I know it creates a problem for you." He looked at her for a long time in the April morning, with the snow still in the shadows of the fir trees and the creek running loud somewhere below them. "It doesn't create a problem," he said carefully. The silence that followed was a particular kind. Not absence of sound, but presence of something neither of them had named yet. She reached into her coat pocket and found the small carved loon she had taken to carrying, the way you carry a stone from a specific shore, not for any reason you can fully articulate, but because your hand knows where it belongs. "We'll go to Pincher Creek in May," she said. "Make it true." He nodded slowly. Something settled in his face the way water settles after a stone. "Yes," he said, "we will." In the weeks that followed, they did not perform any new version of themselves. They simply continued as they had been, Broderick running the late-season trap lines and beginning to repair the fence the wolf's winter panic had damaged, Thea extending the garden plot and beginning, carefully, to press the legal question of homestead title through a letter to a land solicitor in Calgary, whose name Broderick had written on a piece of paper and kept in the tin box under the floor. The silver, if it existed, could wait. The mountain had no interest in their timeline. They rode down to Pincher Creek on the 12th of May, on a morning when the foothills were fully green and the air had the particular quality that Alberta spring air has, clean and cold-edged and full of itself. The Reverend Desjardins was a small, practical man who married people with the same brisk competence he brought to all his duties. The service was short. Broderick's hand was warm and unhesitating when he took hers. Afterward, standing in the road outside the small church, Thea turned the loon over in her coat pocket. Broderick stood beside her, his hat in his hands again, the same small courtesy she had noticed the very first day in her father's yard. "You still carry that," he said, nodding at the shape in her pocket. "Since I found it," she said. He was quiet a moment. "I made it the week after the lake. Kept it because—" He stopped. Tried again. "I didn't know your name. Your father called you away before I could ask. I had nothing else." She pulled the loon from her pocket and held it in her palm between them. The Maylight caught the worn wood, the careful feathers, the initials scratched into the base. "You have my name now," she said. He reached out and gently folded her fingers back over the carving, the way you close a hand around something you are not taking back. "Keep it," he said. "It was always yours." They rode north together, back into the mountains, back into the valley that was not yet legally theirs, but would be eventually, because they intended to stay. The loon was in her pocket. The Alberta spring was everywhere. The high peaks still wore their winter white, but below the timberline, everything was insisting on green, loudly and without apology. That was how it began, and how it continued, not with rescue exactly, and not with surrender, but with two people who had each survived their particular winters choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to build something in the same piece of wilderness. Sometimes love is not lightning. Sometimes it is the patient accumulation of cut wood and shared silence. And the particular way for a man remembers to carry a carved bird for 11 years without knowing why, until the morning he finally understands.